In 1904, a scientist published a study linking lead paint to neurological damage in children. The lead paint industry read that study. They didn't stop making lead paint. They hired researchers to dispute the findings. They launched marketing campaigns targeting children specifically, putting a cartoon mascot called the Dutch Boy on their tins to make the product feel friendly and safe. For the next 70 years, they marketed lead paint as safe. And what you probably don't know is that during those 70 years, an estimated 68 million American children were exposed to lead paint in their homes. Lead causes permanent neurological damage. There is no safe level of exposure for children, and there is no treatment that reverses the damage once it's done. The documents proving the industry knew all of this have been available to the public since 1999. Nobody went to prison. So, before we get into what the industry did, you need to understand what lead actually does to a child's brain. Because once you know that, everything that follows becomes much harder to stomach. Lead is a neurotoxin. When a child under 6 ingests or inhales it, it accumulates in the developing brain and interferes with neurotransmitter function. The effects are permanent. They include reduced IQ, impaired executive function, increased impulsivity, and a measurably increased likelihood of violent behavior later in life. A 2007 study estimated that lead exposure had caused an aggregate IQ loss across the American population equivalent to 23 million IQ points. And here's what makes this so significant. This wasn't disputed science. It wasn't disputed science in 1943 when the American Journal of Public Health connected lead paint to childhood poisoning. It wasn't disputed science in 1904. So, what did the industry actually do with that knowledge? The 3 dominant American lead paint manufacturers were Sherwin-Williams, NL Industries, and Conagra. And what internal documents produced during litigation revealed should make you angry. In 1919, the Lead Industries Association commissioned a study on the health effects of lead. The study found evidence of harm. It was never published. In the 1930s, as European countries began restricting and banning lead paint for residential use, the industry lobbied successfully against equivalent restrictions in the United States. And here's the detail that tells you everything about how these companies operated. In the 1950s, when medical researchers started pushing back, the industry launched a public relations campaign, asserting that lead paint was safe when used as directed. They said poisoning cases were the result of parental negligence. The campaign specifically blamed mothers. Then in the 1970s, when federal regulation became inevitable, they changed strategy. Instead of contesting the science, they started arguing that removing existing lead paint from homes was actually more dangerous than leaving it in place. That argument alone delayed meaningful remediation policy by approximately 2 decades. Now here's the part of the story that most people don't know, and it's the part that changes how you see everything else. The children most affected by lead paint exposure were not evenly distributed across the American population. They were disproportionately Black children living in urban housing. The reason was economic. Lead paint was cheap and durable. It was used extensively in low-income housing throughout the early and mid-20th century. As white middle-class families moved to suburbs in the 1950s and 1960s, they left behind lead-painted housing that was increasingly occupied by Black families migrating from the South. A 1990 CDC study found that Black children were 5 times more likely to have elevated blood lead levels than white children. And what you probably haven't heard is that researchers have published peer-reviewed work arguing that differential lead exposure is a significant contributing factor to racial disparities in educational attainment and incarceration rates in the United States. This isn't a fringe argument. It's been published in mainstream academic journals. It just hasn't entered mainstream policy discussion. In 1999, the internal documents of the lead paint industry became publicly available through litigation. What they confirmed was that the industry had known about the dangers for decades and had actively worked to suppress, dispute, and delay regulation. In 2019, a California judge ordered Sherwin-Williams, NL Industries, and Conagra to pay $409 million in ICE-STATA fund to remediate lead paint in California homes. The ruling was appealed. In 2022, the California Supreme Court reduced the judgment significantly, finding the companies could only be held liable for homes built before 1951. that determination dramatically reduced the remediation fund. Sherwin-Williams posted revenues of $19.9 billion in 2022. The remediation fund, after years of litigation, was $305 million. There are an estimated 37 million homes in the United States that still contain lead paint. And here's the thing that should stay with you after this video. Lead paint is the most documented case of corporate concealment of a public health hazard in American history. But it isn't an isolated case. The strategic playbook the lead paint industry used, fund counter research, blame individual behavior, delay regulation, litigate rather than remediate, was studied and replicated. It was used by the tobacco industry, which acknowledged internally in 1953 that cigarettes caused cancer. It was used by the fossil fuel industry, which acknowledged internally in 1977 that carbon emissions cause climate change. It was used by the sugar industry, which funded research specifically to redirect attention from sugar to fat as the driver of heart disease. In each case, the internal documents proving foreknowledge were eventually released. In each case, the gap between what they knew and what they told the public was measured in decades. In each case, the harm during those decades was quantified in millions of people. The pattern isn't a coincidence, it's a business model. 68 million American children were exposed to lead paint. The companies that made it knew it was harmful in 1904. They are still in business. Sherwin-Williams currently has a market capitalization of approximately $80 billion. The Dutch boy, the cartoon mascot they designed to market lead paint to children, was used in advertising until 1980. He is still the company's logo.